At the turn of the 21st century, more books had been written about Hitler since his death than about Napoleon during the half-century after the latter's demise. Time and distance from the events of World War II have also affected the historical interpretation of Hitler. There is a consensus about his historical importance, a term that does not imply a favorable judgment. Hitler was principally, and alone, responsible for starting World War II. This differed from the various responsibilities of rulers and statesmen who had unleashed World War I. His guilt for implementing the Holocaust, that is, the shift of German policy from the expulsion to the extermination of Jews, including eventually Jews of all of Europe and European Russia, is also apparent. Although no document of his order exists, Hitler's speeches, writings, reports of discussions with associates and foreign statesmen, and testimony by those who carried out the actions have often been cited as evidence of his role. Many of his most violent statements were recorded by his minions during his table talks, including the not entirely authentic Bormann remarks of February-April 1945. For example, on January 30, 1939, to celebrate the 6th anniversary of his rule, Hitler told the Reichstag, "Today I will once more be a prophet, if the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more in a world war. Then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." In his final will, written just before his suicide in April 1945, he charged the Germans to continue the struggle against the Jews. "Above all, I enjoin the government and the people to uphold the race laws to the limit and to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry." Despite the immense mass of surviving German documents, and the large volume of his recorded speeches and other statements, Hitler was, as he himself said on a few occasions, a secretive man, and some of his views and decisions differed at times from his public expressions. For a long time historians and other commentators took it for granted that Hitler's wishes, ambitions, and ideology were clearly, and frighteningly, set forth in Mein Kampf. In the first autobiographical portion of Mein Kampf, however, he twisted the truth in at least 3 matters: his relationship with his father, which was very different from the filial affection he had set forth in Mein Kampf, the conditions of his life in Vienna, which were less marked by abject poverty than he had stated, and the crystallization of his worldview, including his anti-Semitism, during his Vienna years. The evidence now suggests that this crystallization occurred much later, in Munich. The popular view of Hitler often involves assumptions about his mental health. There has been a tendency to attribute madness to Hitler. Despite the occasional evidence of his furious outbursts, Hitler's cruelties and his most extreme expressions and orders suggest a cold brutality that was fully conscious. The attribution of madness to Hitler would of course absolve him from his responsibility for his deeds and words, as it also absolves the responsibility of those who are unwilling to think further about him. Extensive research of his medical records also indicates that, at least until the last 10 months of his life, he was not profoundly handicapped by illness, except for advancing symptoms of Parkinson's disease. What is indisputable is that Hitler had a certain tendency to hypochondria, that he ingested vast amounts of medications during the war, and that as early as 1938, he convinced himself that he would not live long, which may have been a reason for speeding up his timetable for conquest at that time. It should also be noted that Hitler possessed mental abilities that some of his earlier critics denied. These included an astonishing memory for certain details and an instinctive insight into his opponent's weaknesses. Again, these talents increase, rather than diminish, his responsibility for the many brutal and evil actions he ordered and committed. His most amazing achievement was his uniting the great mass of the German and Austrian people behind him. Throughout his career, his popularity was larger and deeper than the popularity of the National Socialist Party. A great majority of Germans believed in him until the very end. In this respect, he stands out among almost all of the dictators of the 19th and 20th centuries, which is especially impressive when we consider that the Germans were among the best educated people in the 20th century. There is no question that the overwhelming majority of the German people supported Hitler, though often only passively. Their trust in him was greater than their trust in the Nazi hierarchy. Of course, what contributed to this support were the economic and social successes, for which he fully took credit. During his early leadership, the virtual disappearance of unemployment, the rising prosperity of the masses, the new social institutions, and the increase of German prestige in the 1930s, achievements unparalleled in the histories of other modern totalitarian dictatorships. In spite of the spiritual and intellectual progenitors of some of his ideas, there is no German national leader to whom he may be compared. In sum, he had no forerunners, another difference between him and other dictators. By 1938 Hitler had made Germany the most powerful and feared country in Europe, and perhaps in the world. He achieved all of this without war, and there are now some historians who state that had he died in 1938 before the mass executions began, he would have gone down in history as the greatest statesman in the history of the German people. In fact, he came very close to winning the war in 1940, but the resistance of Britain, personified by Winston Churchill, thwarted him. Nevertheless, it took the overwhelming, and in many ways unusual, Anglo-American coalition with the Soviet Union to defeat the Third Reich. And there are reasons to believe that neither side would have been able to conquer him alone. At the same time, it was his brutality in some of his decisions that led to his destruction, binding the unusual alliance of capitalists and communists, of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin together. Hitler thought he was a great statesman, but he did not realize the unconditional contemptibility of what he had unleashed. He thought that the coalition of his enemies would eventually break up, and then he would be able to settle with one side or the other. In thinking thus he deceived himself, though such wishes and hopes were also current among many Germans until the end. Open and hidden admirers of Hitler continue to exist, and not only in Germany, some of them because of a malign attraction to the efficacy of evil. Others because of their admiration of Hitler's achievements, no matter how transitory or brutal. However, because of the brutalities and the crimes associated with his name, it is not likely that Hitler's reputation as the incarnation of evil will ever change.